Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 6, Episode 20, presented by Market Dial. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
A very special episode for the people today, back on the podcast with his latest book, launching today, which he described as one of his most significant works in a long list of significant books, Seth Godin, talking about The Song of Significance, a new leadership manifesto.
Yeah, it's great to have Seth back. I think this may be, people hear us talk about this in the interview. I think this may be Seth's fifth time on the podcast, if we include his appearance on my book launch stuff. So it's great to have Seth back. This is a really interesting book, and I'm not even sure now where it's its 20th book, his 20th book, or something like that. I've sort of lost count, but as longtime listeners will know, Seth and I have been friends for over 40 years, which is crazy. So it's been so much fun to just see all the success he's had. And also, I think just kind of the evolution of what he's focused on. This is a much more sort of personal, big picture kind of book as opposed to, say, a marketing book or branding book per se.
Yeah, it is, and it's a great interview. So, which would surprise no one, because Seth is a, so to speak, in the trade, a great interview. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. Now, let's talk about the lead for a bit. The Lead Innovation Conference happening July 12th, 13th. You and I will be together with 2,000 of our closest friends, 140 speakers. We'll be on the main stage kicking it off, along with our very good friend and friend of the pod, Simeon Siegel. I'll be interviewing you two fellas about your latest deep thoughts on the future of direct-to-consumer business models.
Yeah, I think I'm really looking forward to this. It's should be a ton of fun, kind of taking the podcast live on stage with a really interesting topic. And again, longtime listeners will know that Simeon has joined us a couple of times. He's always super interesting, super provocative. Those episodes are always really popular. Yeah, so this should be a ton of fun and very interesting. And it's my first time at the Lead Innovation Summit, so I'm looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, it's excitement building, definitely. Looking forward to it. And for the listeners who might like to join us in July, check out the show notes for links for retailers and brands and a discount code for vendors and suppliers. Get yourself a nice discount. All right, well, let's move on to news of the week. So last week we were talking about earnings. Just a giant tsunami of earnings this week. So we could be the earnings show, basically, or investors are us. But how do we top line this? I guess we should touch on a few keynotes of key retailers. But how do you top line this for the folks, and then maybe take us through a couple of retailers that you think are important to look at because of the bigger story or bigger picture that they start to illustrate for us?
Yeah, it was a big week. I was going through the list and I was like, oh, yeah, this could be like a 3-hour episode if we were to talk about all the earnings. Yeah. So we're not going to do that, as you say. I think really the general impression is pretty consistent with what we talked about last week, which is that broadly speaking, spending is continuing to slow. The consumer is generally to the extent they're spending on products versus services, which is, something we talked about last week, that there's a lot of this shift to services. To the extent they're spending on products, they're tending to spend on essentials, value. We're seeing, this trading down behavior. One of the things I think was interesting, though, last week we talked about apparel spending and department stores and so forth, and how overall the spending is down, and we'll talk about an example in a second. But what was interesting was several apparel retailers actually did quite well, and they really called attention to how kind of more upscale or dressier kind of apparel was doing well. So, for example, Urban Outfitters, the Urban Outfitters brand itself had a weak quarter, but Anthropologie and Free People, which are more upscale, more focused, had really strong sales performance. Free People was up 17%. Anthropologie was up 13%. People can check out our interview with Anthropologie president Anu if they're interested in that.
And what was their philosophy? Edit to
amplify.
Edit to amplify. I love that. I love that.
Yeah,
philosophy.
Which is Abercrombie and Fitch also really strong comp. So really the comments were around, people are going out more relative to last year. People are traveling more relative to last year, more back to office than last year. And all of this is tending to drive spending on dressier, nicer kind of apparel. Now, when you talk more about moderate priced apparel, that continues to be very poor. Gap, for example, did cut their losses, but overall their sales were down about 6%. The Gap brand and Old Navy were essentially flat, but Banana Republic and Athleta were both down about 10%. So still continue to be a lot of struggles at the Gap, and they weren't super optimistic about the rest of the year.
I had a comment on some of the language that they used, and I was reading through the results that they were talking about Athletica product acceptance challenges. Like, was this written by Chat GPT or something? Like, who talks like that? Like, people don't like the stuff we're selling, so we're going to try different stuff. How about that?
Yeah. It's that I think we call that avoidant language in the psychological field. The other one, speaking of hiding the ball or whatever, was Kohl's. Now, you and I were talking off mic. The stock actually went up on this news because Kohl's managed to eke out a very small profit, which was almost entirely driven by cost reduction. Their actual performance, I would say, continues to be objectively terrible. Sales were down, and I went back because I got this kind of time apparently, and looked at Kohl's performance over a 5-year time frame. And I think we did this sometime last year because when Michelle Gass was still there, she was really hyping the success of all their strategic initiatives. We're rolling out Sephora, and those stores are doing great. We're doing Amazon Pickup. Those stores are doing great. We've got these new brand partnerships. Those brands are doing great. And yet, the sales continue to be terrible. So just a couple of quick facts. So if you look at 2018 quarter one sales, they were $4.2 billion. If you look at this past quarter sales, $3.6 billion. So not even adjusting for inflation, they've lost over $600 million in revenue over 5 years. And while they did eke out the small profit, as we mentioned, that profit is half of what they made, again, not adjusted for inflation, 5 years ago. So I call this the Kohl's running to stand still strategy. They've invested a ton. Shout out to a great U2 song, by the way. But they've invested all this effort, and all they have done is continue to lose revenues, lose relevance. So we'll see whether, because they're clearly caught up in a poor cycle for moderate apparel, but their relative performance continues to be bad, and I don't think anybody believes they can cost cut their way to being remarkable.
Well, and they've got some new folks. The lead, former colleague of mine, Dave Alves, is president and COO, basically. So they got some new people and taken over from Michelle Gass. Those changes won't have any kind of short-term impact. I guess if you and I are having a conversation about them in a couple of quarters, we'd more see the efficacy of the new team, I suppose, because it takes a while for those decisions to wash through. So,
yes, well, we shall see.
Wish them the best.
I hope they'll figure it out, and we'll see how. I think Macy's will be out next week, and we'll see the relative performance there because they're the most comparable. Then just cycling quickly back to, again, this is something we've talked about multiple times here, that just in general, big ticket businesses tending not to do well. So the home categories, consumer electronics. We had RH report this week, and they had a very, very weak quarter, which is disappointing because I always talk about RH as being a remarkable brand, and I think they're doing a lot of interesting things, but they clearly have too much inventory. Have had to take a bunch of markdowns, but just in general, they're caught up in the cycle of big ticket items. They're
not as good as retailer as they are, and we think they are. They're not, they can't avoid gravity, basically, is the way I kind of... No,
they can't. A lot of people were going out, and I think he kind of walked into this, but as much as I love Gary Friedman in terms of being a bold leader, he sometimes gets a little bit whiny, and he takes shots at other people, and that kind of came back to hit him because he was very critical over the last year that, if you take a lot of markdowns, you're a terrible retailer. And then, they took all these markdowns, and he basically said we had to, which I think is objectively true. But it didn't, from a messaging standpoint, it wasn't optimal. But we also had Williams-Sonoma call out weakness in their high-end furniture business. But then when you get to other kind of big ticket, like Best Buy, for example, another weak quarter, comp store sales down 10%, earnings down. They did say that they expected this cycle of, not only just kind of the weakness in big ticket more broadly, but also, as we've talked about, the pull forward of demand, that phenomenon, they believe, will start to reverse towards the end of the year. Now, presumably, they've got lots of data and models and perhaps some consumer research to help inform that. So they kind of said like this, we're starting to see the beginning, the end of this down cycle. Then lastly, really quickly, Lowe's. We saw Home Depot report last week. Lowe's, basically the same story. Comp store sales down about 4%. Their earnings were kind of flat. I mean, a lot of companies are managing, as we look at their earnings, we've got this phenomenon of cost cutting, layoffs and things that are rippling through. We also have that, generally speaking, freight costs are lower this year relative to last year. So they're getting a little bit of positive spin in earnings, kind of, I wouldn't say one time, but it's kind of a short-lived phenomenon in that comparison.
Last episode, we were talking about a couple of things, sporting goods and footwear. Let's talk about Dick's, because they seem to be, I don't know if they're going against the trend. They're a great retailer, and they posted some strong results. What do you think about the news coming out of Dick's Sporting Goods? Yeah,
again, this is a little bit of the expectations game. Their performance is a little weaker than Wall Street was expecting, but Dick's has been on a real tear for 2-3 years now. So their comp store sales were positive, solid relative to most other people in that they were positive. They're continuing to roll out new formats. So they have this more kind of deluxe format called House of Sport that they apparently are getting great results on, and they're rolling that out. They're also rolling out outlet stores, so part of this kind of hybrid portfolio strategy we've talked about. And they called out strength in footwear. And yes, last week we were talking about Foot Locker's challenges, and some of this is caught up in Nike's reconfiguring of their distribution network, which, frankly, we'll probably talk with Simeon about on stage.
Adidas missteps with the whole
Adidas missteps. And Hoka had good results, and On Running, as we talked about last week, had good results. So there's a lot of turbulence, I guess you could say, in the sports footwear market. Dick's clearly appears to be taking share right now. Foot Locker appears to be leaking share. But overall, even though the kind of sporting goods COVID bump has waned a bit, definitely appears that Dick's is gaining relative market share, which is fantastic for them.
Let's talk about a different end of the spectrum in the value retailers. Five Below announcing they're going to open 400 new U.S. stores. Now they're heading to like 3,000 plus stores. Are they going to be at the point where a new Five Below would just open up in a local Five Below? I mean, that's a lot of stores.
I expect a Five Below to open up in my backyard any day now.
Exactly.
No, it's just a retailer that I wouldn't say they've come out of nowhere, but they've really come on very strongly in the last several years. Apparently, once again, fans, physical retail, still not dead. They are strong performance. They keep opening stores, definitely one of the most successful retailers to emerge. And I think this is another example of both the general shift to value, but it's also, I think, another example. It is kind of like this edit to amplify sort of strategy of, really honing in on a particular set of customers and purchase occasions and doing it in a very distinctive way. And I think, what we're seeing generally over the last several years is these sort of retailers are able to steal share away from the what I'd call the little bit of everything kind of retailers, like a Kohl's, like a Macy's, like a JCPenney. So great story. Maybe we'll get their CEO on the podcast next season.
Let's wrap with a more troublesome story. I don't know what to make of this exactly. Target's pulling some LGBTQ merchandise from the stores. I see some performative bullshit from social media, people going into the stores. And I guess, if you're sitting in their chairs, recent events in the beverage category point to caution. But is that exactly the end result, that whatever these people are looking to do is to force people to second guess, to compromise? Like, what do you make of all this? And, I don't think Target's in an easy place, but I think they got to make a decision on this. But it's complicated, right?
Well, I do appreciate from Target's point of view, if there are significant perceived dangers to their store associates, they have to act. And unfortunately, we have, what amounts to terrorist action on the part of some very organized people that are, phenomenally ignorant and hateful, just going after companies for, these supposed woke positions. I mean, it's ridiculous and offensive. And I think broadly speaking, personally and as a society, we can't tolerate, what amounts to blackmail and very, on the scheme of things, obviously small terrorist actions. But I think it's quite clear that people like Matt Walsh, I'll just call him out, is behind a lot of this, and there's money. And so they're picking spots. You can go on social media and see what Matt Walsh has said about it. And it's very clear what he's trying to do. And, it's a guy probably somewhere or other is going to end up in jail if he's not careful. So, but I think it's a really difficult issue. I think as just basic human beings, we should push back against this sort of hateful action. I think it is really challenging for companies to know specifically what to do. But the other question is, well, are companies not supposed to? It's very clear, not to get into a rant really about it, though I probably already crossed the line. A lot of what is said on social media is just factually incorrect, and you can tell whether it's bots or whatever that is very intentional. People are like, oh, I'm going to shop at Walmart because they sell American flags, like as if Target doesn't sell American flags. And also, by the way, Walmart sells Pride merchandise. So it's not even just factually correct, but, they clearly have an agenda. And I think the question is, are we going to, as companies, as leaders, are we going to allow these small terroristic type forces? And, ironically, these are often, fueled by people like Elon Musk, who supposedly are free speech. What is he called? Free speech absolutists, to dictate what sort of products companies can carry. If you think, they shouldn't carry Pepsi because it's got sugar. Pick your issue, right? Like different people can disagree or agree on what sort of products should be carried. But, if you're going after people based on hate and trying to basically terrorize companies into not carrying products, we've got to push back on that, I think, absolutely, because I think not only is it terrible in this particular instance, but if this were to escalate, it would be very bad, I think, for lots of people.
All right. Well, that's a wrap on this episode. Now, just before, or at least the news part of this episode, now just before we get to our excellent interview with a friend of the pod and your personal friend, Seth Godin, let's hear from our presenting sponsor. If you're a retailer hungry for a better way to gain useful insight on the impacts of your store layout, design, and strategic initiatives, you need to know Marketile. Marketile is an easy-to-use testing platform that emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With Marketile, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. Validate your remarkable ideas with Marketile's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at Marketile.com. That's Marketile.com.
All right. Well, Seth Godin, welcome back to the Remarkable Retail Podcast. We're going to have to get you one of those 5-timer jackets like they have on Saturday Night Live, I think. I think this might be your 5th time. Does that sound about right to you?
It's always amazing that you have me back. So thanks for giving me another chance to get it right.
All right. Well, we're going to keep doing this until we get it right. But it's great to have you back. Now, there's always plenty to talk about, but the particular thing we're talking about is your new book, The Song of Significance, which actually is going to come out the day that we're releasing this episode. So that's very nice timing. But tell us about this book. What was the motivation? How did you come about with this idea amongst all the other books you've written?
There's so many different ways into it, but as often, we should probably start with Amazon. Half of all the warehouse injuries in the entire country happened at Amazon last year. In 2021, an internal memo at Amazon said that in some cities, they have had so much turnover that they believe they have run out of people in the entire city who are willing to come work for them. What I learned from watching Amazon's race to the bottom, combined with watching brutal billionaires subjecting their employees to ridiculous public humiliation, combined with AI and outsourcing, is there's a fork in the road. And sometimes when you see a fork in the road, you should take it. And one side of the fork is, are we going to race to the bottom and maximize convenience and low price at all costs? Or are we going to race to the top and bring humanity back to work? And I felt this time in particular like it was personal. And I basically was lucky enough that my editor let me rant. And it has resonated with the people who read it so far. They moved it up 6 months, which they never do, because it's timely and it's urgent.
I think one of the statements you make right at the beginning is that work isn't working. And what do you mean by that? I think that resonates with a lot of people, but what in particular do you mean?
Well, so here's the first question. Is the purpose of culture to enable capitalism, or is the purpose of capitalism to enable us to have the lives we want to live? And when industrialism and department stores and everything else came hand in hand with mass media, we created an enormous amount of productivity and wealth. And people said, yeah, it's worth it. It's worth it for me to go to the factory every day because of what I can do for my family. But in the last 10 or 15 years, as so many organizations have struggled to become ever more hyper efficient, to honor Milton Friedman's edict, to make more money for the CEO, they haven't created a place where people feel like people. I think what it means to say work isn't working is it's working for the boss. It might be working for some shareholders, but it's not working for the people who are sacrificing 90,000 hours of their life, and we can do better than that.
What strikes me as interesting is I'm in the same situation that Steve is, that you are. I don't in some ways have a dog in the fight or dog in the hunt around working in offices, because I haven't worked in an office in a long time. So it's interesting that it catches your attention, because there's a lot of energy around the dialogue of where and how people work right now. Did that also get you thinking about that? Because there's, what we call the work from home or work anywhere or hybrid work, and it seems to be sticking, and there's a big push and pull, and, between threatening employees to come back versus cajoling them versus enticing them to come back. Did this all kind of swirl around your thinking around at least the corporate work?
Well, what a profound shift in the environment of the industrialized world to, in a 4-week period of time, without the economy missing much of a beat, suddenly millions and millions and millions and millions of people aren't getting their dry cleaning done, have established an office that isn't where their office is. Well, it was inevitable once we had Zoom and the internet. But the real interesting question is, why do bosses care so much? And I think the reason they care is similar to the reason that open hiring has had such a difficult time getting adopted. So I'll talk about open hiring first. If you've ever had Ben & Jerry's ice cream, you may have had the brownie flavor. They make all of the brownies for Ben & Jerry's brownie ice cream 4 miles from my house at the Grayston Bakery, which was founded by a Buddhist monk named Bernie Glassman. And one of the things that they do is they have a clipboard at the front desk, and anyone who wants to can put their name on the clipboard. And when a job opens up, the next person on the list gets hired. Doesn't matter if you're previously incarcerated, doesn't matter if you've had a drug problem, doesn't matter if you've never had a job. The next person gets hired. This is called open hiring. And it is an extraordinarily important way to build resilience and redemption into our communities. But not that many companies have adopted it, even though they work very hard to share the technique. The Body Shop did. The Body Shop was having a lot of trouble filling jobs and a lot of trouble with turnover. They adopted open hiring, and they discovered turnover went down 60%, and productivity on all of their measures went up 15%. This is in the retail environment. And yet, even in the face of that, most organizations don't do it because the boss wants to think that they have some sort of special instinct about who would be good at this job. And the boss also finds peace of mind in surveilling their employees, making sure, quote, they're really working, calling Zoom meetings to make sure that people who are remote are in their chairs paying attention.
Turn your camera on.
And all of those things are false proxies. They're false proxies for what actually makes a difference. Now that we're getting so much smarter at what creates value, we're finding it's painful but urgent that we get rid of the false proxies.
But I think it's a really interesting point. But there seems to me like there's a lot of things where the evidence is overwhelmingly in support of taking a particular set of actions, yet people still don't do it. And so I'm wondering, would you agree? I think you would agree with that, right? It's not a matter of the data supporting a particular set of actions. It's a matter of people's mindset and their fear or their need for this illusion of control and so forth. How would you suggest and I know you go into this in the book, but can you give our audience a little bit of a sense of how you would suggest making this change towards providing or creating more significance in the work that teams and their organizations do?
Because you're Steve, I can tell you just how audacious I am seeking to be here. Most people who hear about this say, oh, sure, let's create things that make people feel significant at work. They're just lying to themselves, because making people feel significant at work is not the same as making people actually significant at work. And you can't, the same way when the internet came along, there were a lot of skeuomorphs. There was a lot of, this is just like the real world, except click on the picture of a book as opposed to touch the book. That's not what you could do if you wanted to do what was best for the internet. That it's not just the real world, but with a mouse. It's different. Email is not just a postal letter, but faster. The post-industrial workforce is not just like the industrial workforce, except with better snacks and a feeling of significance. It's different. Because what we now know is that mediocre work and any work that can be written down in a spec can either be done by an AI or outsourced really cheap. You don't need to go out of your way to pay people to do that work the way you used to. So what's left? What's left is this human work of making a change happen. You can't just say, well, I'm going to let a little bit of light into this place because it's still a dank basement. What you have to do is say, we are going to create value for people by raising our standards and making a change for the customer, a change in the side effects, a change for the employees, a significant change. Because when a change happens, we find meaning in that work. And people will, yes, pay $80 for an $8 t-shirt if it comes with meaning. The retailers who are trying to out Amazon are just going to keep failing. And it was interesting. David Risher, who was one of the architects of Amazon, left there to do some stuff, and now he's back as the CEO of Uber. And he just ordered, and I use that word carefully, he just ordered all employees back to headquarters at least 3 days a week. He came up with this nonsense about magic can happen when you have a whiteboard in front of people. Yeah. But what he's really saying is he's too lazy and too scared to reimagine a different sort of work, a distributed sort of work, the work that powers automatic, the work that creates movements. That work doesn't require people to go to the office. It simply requires people to find meaning.
Let's unpack a couple of things I hear a lot when speaking to retail other CEOs. They talk about the productivity being fantastic from work from home or work from wherever or hybrid. What they worry about is a couple of things. One is, and I'd love you to get your thoughts on this. One is that the younger employees don't have mentors or mentorship and attachment to the culture. And the second is just, what you were just saying. And I think there's no demonstrable proof that it happens. This water cooler talk doesn't happen. The inspiration in the parking lot kind of stuff where we're not generating new ideas. Innovation is hard or can't happen. Take on both of those one at a time. The whole thing that there is a deficit if you're a young person sitting at home. Maybe you're just sitting at home alone in a little concrete box. It's not that fun. You're not meeting people. A lot of people meet their partners in workplace. How do we square this circle and get the best of both worlds?
Oh, I remember visiting our erstwhile colleague Steve in Chicago and walking the halls of Sears and noting just how many people were in the hall having substantial conversations, honest interactions with each other, mentoring and teaching. Oh, no, that was a different building. The fact this is just because there's cubicles doesn't mean that there are interactions happening. When I was at Yahoo, the back room where I was a cube farm with more than 1,000 people on one floor. And there was none of that because you have to do it on purpose. And it's easier to do it on purpose online. That, no matter how hard Elon Musk has tried for the last 6 months, he just can't kill Twitter. People just are having trouble leaving. Why is that? The whole place is online, and yet people get hooked. They get hooked on their circle. They get hooked on the interactions. They get hooked on what they can say and what they can hear. And if you do it on purpose, you can do it online. And I just think it's so dramatically overrated, this sort of random bumping into people at the water cooler. The water cooler is not that busy a place.
I guess I'm curious, Seth. I mean, it's hard to separate exactly what you said in the book versus things I've heard you say over the years or you've written about in your blog, taking on kind of meeting culture and meetings in general. Do you have any thoughts on what meetings should be for, how to make the best of them, and how they really kind of contribute to this malaise that we're seeing in a lot of corporate cultures?
And this is a great topic for this particular podcast, because what do retailers actually make? Because they don't make the stuff they sell generally. What they make is decisions. Meetings are often misnamed. A real meeting, is a conversation in which lots of people who are in it, more than 80%. So if there's two people, that means both, are talking and listening, moving toward a decision. This is different than a mandatory group lecture in which one person who was too lazy to write a good memo or edit a good 5-minute video calls everyone together so they can share their thoughts out loud as they think of them. And this is very common. And it's done as an exercise in status and in taking attendance. It's an artifact similar to going to 4th grade fractions class. But that doesn't help us make better decisions. And we have lots of ways to have actual meetings. But first, the person who is calling the meeting has to be willing to have one, as opposed to just be taking attendance.
Seth, are you familiar with the concept of holacracy? I had the opportunity to interview, I can't say he was the CEO, but because he described his role differently from Freitag, which is a great company that makes bags out of recycled truck tarps in Europe. But he described the holacracy. Is this closer to the pin about how you envision the workplace being successful?
Tony Hsieh, what a tragic story, R.I.P. He was the loudest proponent of it in the U.S. I think it's extraordinarily difficult to do at all, and certainly to retrofit into an existing organization. I think it could be argued that Zappos left billions of dollars in value on the table as they tried to shift into that. What I learned from building the Carbon Almanac with 300 other people, all volunteers, including me, is it is possible to relentlessly raise standards. It is possible to be unbelievably productive, especially if you spend very little time talking about the process of the process. That when you show people the board, they can play the board game. But if you're going to have to spend half your time arguing about the rules, it's really challenging. So are there holacracies in the world? For sure. But I don't think it matches with the power dynamic that customers require of, you made me a promise, I expect you to keep it and exceed it.
A lot of times when I read your stuff, I'm certainly very inspired, but I'm also, I guess, colored by my time either working at or working for very large corporations. In many cases, these are publicly traded companies. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on how hard it is to get started on some of these things when you're part of a much bigger organization, particularly if you're at the top of that organization, and you perceive anyway that you have to kowtow to quarterly earnings and expectations of, driving top line sales, ever increasing productivity, those sort of things, which tend to be much more short term oriented. And it feels to me like some of the things you were suggesting here while you can make some small starts, to really make a big change might take quite a lot of effort over quite a long period of time.
Yeah, this is almost precisely what they said at Western Union when they had the chance to buy AT&T. It's also what Toyota said when the electric car showed up, and everything in between. That you are absolutely correct in everything that you said. And your competition, perhaps more adroit, perhaps differently funded, is going to do it. So then what are you going to do?
Right.
And what we have seen from Sears and Macy's and Lord & Taylor and all the others is you can do what the stock market wants tomorrow, but you might not be here next year to tell us about it.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can take a deep breath and realize that if what we make is decisions and a different approach to making decisions and then implementing them is going to satisfy a new marketplace faster, better, more profitably, either you're going to do it or somebody else is. So I'm not asking anybody who runs an organization to settle for less. What I'm saying is humans are not a resource. Humans are the point. And shifting fundamentally away from Peter Drucker to a different set of expectations and interactions is happening right here, right now. And if you want the kind of people who have a choice about where to work, this is the only way you're going to be able to dance with them.
Yeah, I think, and something I'm working on, as you and I have talked about in my new book, is that I think there's a fundamental misperception at a lot of companies about what the riskiest thing is, right? Like it's really the opposite of what they often think that is riskiest, right? It's the failure to make these bold changes or to get started now, as opposed to when they get forced into reactivity. That is really the most risky decision.
Also, this is a fine time. First of all, I can't wait to read the new book, but this is a fine time to invoke Schumpeter, which is it's okay if companies go out of business and are replaced by the next thing. When the airlines were whining during COVID for a bailout, you know what? We should have let them go out of business because the planes weren't going to go away and the airports weren't going to go away, and we could have refactored how they were organized and kept flying. Mm-hmm. And if you are really stuck because you made the mistake of selling ownership in your company to short-term thinking people who are underinformed, then maybe you should go work somewhere else and do something important instead.
Seth, this is a fantastic discussion. I mean, it's a lot to get your arms around, and I'm thinking of our listeners who are somewhere in an organization, perhaps in a leadership role. What are the kind of 1, 2, or 3 steps that you talk about in the book and that you think yourself to get started on this journey, to really rethink and, become the brownie supplier type company, to just change from what you do today? I mean, if we took it all the way back to the beginning, Amazon's purposeful, very purposeful. They like turnover. It's in their policy. So go all the way to where you think we should be. And what are the kind of couple practical steps you can begin with? There's one practical step that has to be before any of them. And it's a simple sentence. And Manad Khosla put it on the title of his book, Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play. What Jeff Bezos did in the first 3 years of Amazon is extraordinary. He made a clear statement to every employee, every investor, every senior leader, let's get real or let's not play. We're going to have a different way we do meetings. We're going to have a different way we track growth. We're going to have a different way. This is what we are building here, a thing, a better thing, a new thing, a different thing. Having the conversation about what would it be like if we made a commitment to each other. I promise to pay attention in your meeting if you promise not to call a meeting that could be replaced by a memo. Let's get real or let's not play. We can go down the list of the kinds of interactions. Let's agree that we will relentlessly criticize the work and raise our standards, and we will never criticize the worker. Let's embrace the fact that turnover is a good thing if it means that the people here are enrolled in where we are going, not simply here because they can't find a better job. In the book, I outline about 15 of these, and I also ask 150 different questions throughout the book. Let's talk about it, because pretending that we're going to get to the other side of this and go back to normal is extraordinarily naive.
This is the new normal, and this is as stable as the world is ever going to be again.
And last question from my side, then I'll pass the mic back to Steve to wrap up. But you've written a lot of books. You write constantly. How do you get excited? Are you excited about this book more than the others, or is that like asking people about which is their favorite kid? Like, how do you think of that when your latest book comes out?
Steve has heard me say it before that I'm done with publishing. And
I was going to bring that up. The number of times you've told me that this is my last book, I'm never writing another one again. And then, like, I got a new book coming out next week.
It's a silly thing to do because you can spread an idea, a certain kind of idea, to more people faster in other ways. But this one is personal. This is the one that has moved me to tears while I was writing it, and even sometimes when I talk about it on a podcast. This is the one that I feel like I have been getting ready to write for a long time. I don't wake up in the morning saying to myself, I need to write a book now. I used to. That's what I did for a living. Mm-hmm. I don't anymore. Now it's a sacrifice. But when I brought this book to my editor and Nikki said, we need to move this up, that this is urgent, I felt something inside of me that I hadn't felt in a long time. This is something I need to say, and I feel very different about this one.
Well, that's probably a good place to end it. I'm not sure what I could really add to that, but I would, you were nice enough to share an early version of the book with me. I really loved it, and I would very much encourage people to go check it out. And I think I didn't know there were 150 questions, but I thought, or I found so many of those questions to be really, really provocative and really challenging. And if you want an inspiring read, but also something that really causes you to question how we got here, what we're doing, I think this is the book for you. So thanks, Seth, again for joining us. We'll send you your 5-timer jacket in the mail shortly, and I'm sure you'll wear it proudly on future appearances. Thanks so much, Seth.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thank you, Steve. Always a pleasure.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platforms, so you can catch up with all our great interviews, including Judith McKenna, President, International, Walmart. New episodes of Season 6, presented by our friends at Market Dial, will show up each and every Tuesday. And be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and producer, and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn. You can catch up with me on the stage at Store Conference in Toronto, May 31st. And you can see both of us at the Lead Innovation Summit in July, live on stage in New York with our friend of the pod, Simeon Siegel from BMO. Until then, safe travels, everyone.